Two motorcycles cutting across the sun-baked lanes of a California freeway. Mirrored sunglasses catching the light. A theme song that somehow made writing a speeding ticket look like the coolest job on earth. That was CHiPs, the show that turned the California Highway Patrol into a Saturday night sensation. When it premiered on NBC in September 1977, nobody would have blamed you for expecting a snooze. The pitch on paper was about as glamorous as a DMV waiting room. Two cops on motorcycles, mostly dealing with fender benders, stalled cars, and the occasional lost tourist. Not exactly the stuff of primetime legend. And yet, thanks to two very different leading men, the steady, square-jawed Larry Wilcox as Officer John Baker, and the electric, grinning Erik Estrada as Officer Frank Poncherello, the show became a genuine phenomenon. 6 seasons, 139 episodes, millions of kids who suddenly wanted a Kawasaki and a leather jacket. But behind those sunny freeway chases was a production full of strange stories. A character who almost had a completely different ethnicity. A leading man who couldn't ride a motorcycle when he was cast. A near-fatal on-set crash. A shocking mid-series cast swap involving an Olympic gold medalist. And a rivalry between the two stars that stayed hidden from the public for decades. Buckle your helmet, because we're counting down 15 facts about CHiPs that even longtime fans might not know. And stick around for the very end, because the story of what really happened between Ponch and John behind the scenes is stranger and sadder than most viewers ever realized. By the time CHiPs hit its stride, Erik Estrada's Ponch was arguably the reason half of America tuned in every week. Teen magazines put him on their covers. He was routinely named one of the most attractive men on television. Fans mailed in sacks of letters. For a huge chunk of the viewing audience, Ponch wasn't just a character. He was the show, which makes it all the stranger that the role was never written with Estrada, or with a Latino actor at all in mind. During early development, the character was named Frank Poncherelli, conceived as an Italian-American officer. When Estrada came into audition, the story goes that he stumbled over a line, got frustrated with himself, and slammed his hand against a door in the room. Rather than showing him the exit, the producers hired him. Once he had the job locked in, Estrada didn't just settle into the role quietly. He walked into the producer's office and made a pitch of his own. He argued that primetime television had never really given audiences a Hispanic-American police officer as a genuine, admired lead character, and he wanted to be the one to change that. He suggested shifting the surname from the Italian Poncherelli to the more Latin Poncherello. The producers agreed. That single conversation is the reason television got the Ponch everyone remembers, and reportedly helped open doors for a wave of Latino actors who came after him. Here's a fun production problem. You build an entire show around two motorcycle cops, and then you discover that one of your two leads has never actually ridden a motorcycle in his life. That's exactly the situation CHiPs found itself in when Estrada was cast as Ponch. He had zero riding experience going into the role, a fairly significant issue for a series where the bike functions almost like a third main character. The production scrambled to get him up to speed, putting him through an intensive training course to teach him the basics of handling, balance, and control before cameras started rolling. It wasn't an instant fix. Estrada has said it took him multiple attempts to actually pass his motorcycle licensing test. Somewhere out there, an examiner failed the man who would go on to become one of the most recognizable motorcycle riders in television history, at least for his first try or two. He caught on quickly enough that within a season or so, audiences had no idea he hadn't grown up around bikes. By the time the show became a hit, his riding looked completely natural. Watching CHiPs in reruns, it's easy to assume the show was a smash from the very first episode. The concept was fun, the visuals were sunny and appealing, and the two leads had obvious chemistry. Surely NBC knew they had a hit on their hands right away. They didn't. When CHiPs debuted in the fall of 1977, the early ratings were unimpressive, and critical reviews were often harsh. Some reviewers dismissed the show outright. NBC had it scheduled on a weeknight where it struggled to find an audience, and the network reportedly considered pulling the plug before it even had a real chance to build momentum. What kept it alive, according to accounts from people involved with the show, was support from executives at NBC who believed in the concept even when the numbers were shaky. Instead of canceling it outright, the network made one key change. It moved CHiPs to a Saturday night slot. That shift made a real difference. Families started finding the show. Kids latched onto Ponch and John, and the ratings climbed steadily until CHiPs became one of the network's more dependable performers. For most fans, CHiPs simply meant Ponch and John, which is exactly why one stretch of Season 5 feels so jarring to revisit. By the early 1980s, Estrada had become a legitimate TV star, and with the show closing in on syndication, a moment where reruns can become extremely lucrative, he wanted a bigger piece of the financial pie. When the studio wouldn't meet his demands, the dispute escalated into a serious standoff, and Estrada stopped showing up to work. That left producers short their most popular star, with episodes still left to film. Their solution was about as unusual as TV casting gets. They brought in Bruce Jenner, the 1976 Olympic decathlon gold medalist and one of the most famous athletes in the country at the time, to join the cast as a new officer alongside John. Jenner was already a skilled motorcyclist, which made him a practical, if unexpected, fit for the physical demands of the role. Audiences, however, weren't interested in a CHiPs without Ponch. Even though Jenner handled the assignment reasonably well, ratings dipped noticeably during his run. That drop in viewership ultimately gave the studio the leverage, or the motivation, to settle the contract dispute with Estrada. He returned, the temporary storyline was wrapped up, and the show went back to business as usual. Unlike a lot of late 1970s cop dramas that leaned on shootouts and over-the-top action for their thrills, CHiPs tried, at least in spirit, to look and feel like an accurate depiction of highway patrol life, and a surprising amount of that authenticity was literal. The patrol cars used throughout production were genuine California Highway Patrol-style Dodge Cruisers, reportedly acquired through police vehicle auctions rather than built as movie props. The motorcycles the actors rode were real police-spec Kawasaki models, the same general class of bike actual CHP officers used at the time. That commitment to realism traces back to the show's creator, Rick Rossner, who didn't dream up the concept purely from imagination. Rossner had spent time working as a reserve deputy with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and by some accounts the idea for the show clicked into place after he watched a pair of CHP motorcycle officers ride past during a break. Because of that background, he understood that real highway patrol work is less about gunfights and more about accident response, stranded motorists, and traffic management, and he pushed the show to reflect that, even while still delivering the crashes and drama a network drama needed. Picture the classic lineup of the village people, the cowboy, the construction worker, the biker, and right in front, the cop, decked out in a tight uniform, aviators, and a stern expression. Now picture Erik Estrada's Ponch, parked on his motorcycle in a snug CHP uniform with mirrored sunglasses. The resemblance isn't a coincidence. According to Estrada, he was told that the group's police officer persona was modeled directly on his look. The fitted uniform, the hat, the general, "I need to see your license and registration" energy, just transplanted from the California freeway to a disco stage. Rather than being bothered by it, Estrada reportedly took it as a compliment. Being cited as inspiration for one of the most recognizable and parodied costumes in pop music history isn't the worst thing that could happen to a TV cop. Show business has a long history of families who keep turning up across generations, the Fondas, the Douglases, and in a smaller but genuinely charming way, the Pine family belongs on that list too. Long before Chris Pine was piloting the Enterprise as Captain Kirk in the rebooted Star Trek films, his father, Robert Pine, was a series regular on CHiPs, playing Sergeant Joseph Getrair, the perpetually exasperated commanding officer stuck supervising Ponch and John's chaos. In a nice bit of behind-the-scenes overlap, Robert Pine's real-life wife at the time, actress Gwen Gilford, played Getrair's on-screen wife. While Gilford was actually pregnant with their son in real life, the idea came up to write that pregnancy into an episode storyline. Production delays, including an industry strike, pushed the timeline back, and by the time the relevant episode finally went in front of cameras, Gilford had already given birth. So she wore a pregnancy pillow under her costume to recreate the look for the scene. In other words, there's a strong case that the future Captain Kirk had a storyline connected to him on CHiPs before he'd ever actually appeared on screen anywhere. One of the most enjoyable things about revisiting long-running shows like CHiPs decades later is spotting famous faces before they were famous, and CHiPs is loaded with them. Running 139 episodes across 6 seasons meant a huge number of guest and supporting roles needed to be filled, and plenty of future stars passed through. Michelle Pfeiffer appeared on the show years before becoming one of the defining film stars of her generation. Bryan Cranston turned up in the early 1980s, long before Malcolm in the Middle or Breaking Bad made him a household name. Ed Harris made an appearance before building his respected film career. David Caruso showed up years before his sunglasses and one-liners persona became a signature. And Michael Dorn spent time playing a recurring officer on the show before eventually becoming known worldwide as Worf on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Watching old episodes now can feel a little like flipping through a yearbook full of people nobody yet realized would become household names. By modern television standards, it's hard to imagine a cop show going more than an episode or two without someone drawing a weapon. CHiPs ran for 6 seasons and 139 episodes, and across that entire run, Ponch and John reportedly drew their firearms on screen only a small handful of times. Some estimates put the number in the low single digits for the whole series. That wasn't an accident. NBC was leaning into a broader push against excessive violence on television in the late 1970s, and CHiPs fit naturally into that approach. An action-adjacent show built around vehicle chases and rescues instead of shootouts. It also lined up with what creator Rick Rossner wanted from the start, since he knew from his own reserve deputy experience that real highway patrol work centers on accidents, stalled cars, and traffic enforcement far more often than armed confrontations. So instead of gunfights, viewers got motorcycle chases and freeway pileups. On the rare occasions a weapon actually appeared, it often wasn't even Ponch or John holding it. It tended to involve a supporting officer character reacting to an unusual guest star threat. Turns out you could build a hit cop show on charm and crash scenes instead of firepower. You've almost certainly heard his music, even if a name doesn't ring a bell. The soaring fanfare from Back to the Future. The gentle, drifting piano theme from Forrest Gump. The tense, propulsive score from Predator. All of that came from composer Alan Silvestri, and he built his early career, in large part, on CHiPs. In the late 1970s, Silvestri was a young composer working low-budget gigs when CHiPs gave him steady, primetime employment. He went on to compose the score for most of the series, not the famous disco-flavored theme song, which was written separately, but the underlying music running through the chases and rescues week after week for years. That steady work on CHiPs helped establish him in the industry, and not long after the series wrapped, he connected with director Robert Zemeckis, a partnership that would eventually lead to some of the most recognizable film scores in Hollywood history. CHiPs followed Estrada home in a way few TV roles ever do for an actor. Over the years, real police officers repeatedly approached him, not for an autograph, but to tell him that watching Ponch as kids was part of what inspired them to go into law enforcement themselves. Estrada had actually wanted to be a police officer long before he became an actor, and decades after CHiPs ended, he made that childhood goal real. He served as a reserve officer in Muncie, Indiana, later worked as a deputy sheriff in Bedford County, Virginia, and eventually became a reserve officer in the small town of St. Anthony, Idaho, where much of his focus centered on internet safety programs for children. None of it was a publicity stunt.